Schools, Chapter 61. Immediately after the war, a private school was opened and run by two teachers, Miss Pearl and Miss Theophilus, who must have been in their early 30s at the time. Miss Pearl, who was either Anglo-Indian or Anglo-Burmese, was plump and light-skinned, with chubby cheeks, pouty lips slightly turned down at the corners, mean eyes and permed shoulder-length hair, which she held back off her face with a hairpin on each side. Miss Theophilus, who was South Indian Christian, was slender and dark-skinned, with short straight hair cut straight across to just below her ears. These two lived together with countless dogs, and the rumor was that they were lesbians, and that Miss Pearl, who was the dominant one, bullied the subservient Miss Theophilus. Their house sat on a slight elevation at the far end of the grounds, while a 2-story wooden house about 100 yards further down served as the school. From the crumbled foundations on the grounds, it was apparent that the main entrance that had stood there before the war had been bombed, and the jungle had reclaimed what must have been a beautifully landscaped garden. We explored the area to our heart's content, for there were hardly any classes to attend. As far as I recall, the only students attending were my siblings, my cousin, and myself. At that time I was called Janu, the pet name I was given by my family, and I liked the name because it meant beloved, but apparently, according to Miss Theophilus, that was not a suitable name for a student in her school. So soon after we enrolled, she sat down with my sister Rafia and asked her what my real name was. On being told that it was Maimuna, she decided that it was too complicated, and between the two of them, they decided to call me Mona. Our mother had recently bought a sewing machine, and when Miss Theophilus found out that my mother stitched clothes, all of our clothes, she thought this was wonderful, and then asked me one day to come over to her house. I happily went along and approached their bungalow at the top of the grounds. As I got close to the front door, I was met by a chorus of dogs barking, growling, and yipping. I almost changed my mind, afraid of being enveloped by a mob of snarling, biting canines. Bracing myself, I timidly knocked on the door, and barking, hinting of hysteria, ensued as Miss Theophilus came to the door. She opened it a crack, held the dogs back, and asked me to wait outside, and quickly closed it. She returned a few minutes later, stepped outside, shut the door, and handed me a piece of blue and white checked cotton fabric. Then, digging her hand into her pocket, she lifted out a fistful of candy, and placing them in my hand, asked me if my mother would stitch a dress for her with the fabric. I, of course, made very agreeable by the sweets in my hand, said she most certainly would. My mother, I must say, wasn't very pleased with me, but she stitched a dress for her just the same. Soon the Italian nuns returned to Colour, and the convent was reopened as a school. Our parents immediately decided to enroll us in a proper school, and so for a very short time we attended St. Agnes's Convent. Chapter 62. Kingswood. Not to be outdone by the Catholics, the Methodist missionaries also returned to Colour, and Kingswood was re-established as a school. With wonderful memories of the school as it was before the war, and with hopes of getting a similar education to the higher standards of that earlier time, we were once again transferred to a different school and found ourselves in Kingswood. The following is an excerpt from the Methodist Church 10th Annual Report, 1949 to 1950, which had this to say about the school. And here I quote, "Kingswood School, with its American course of study, meant primarily to prepare children from Western families for life in America, has its unique place in the total contribution of Christian education to Burma. Children from leading homes in the southern Shan states spent 9 months out of the year here with boys and girls of other lands. Christian idealism permeates every part of the program so that these young lives will forever bear its imprint. Miss Mabel Reed and her colleagues have been entirely cut off from the others in Rangoon and have kept classes going under most difficult circumstances. It has now become a gamble whether classes can continue until the end of the school year in December. These are indeed evil days for Burma, but there are more. There are days filled with an unprecedented challenge to Christians everywhere. Outside of Christ, how can fear, hatred, bitterness, and distress be replaced by faith, love, brotherhood, and right relationships? Burma needs Christ as never before. End of quote. But many things about the school had changed, even though some of the teachers returned. Miss Mabel Reed, mentioned in the article, who became the principal, was a large lady who wore her gray hair in a bob cut. She was very down to earth and looked more like the stereotypical farmer's wife than the head of a school. She was laid back and pleasant, so that we felt quite comfortable in her presence, perhaps a little too comfortable, because though the building resembled a school, organization and structure were lacking. An ad hoc arrangement of children of various abilities and age ranges were lumped together into the same classes. I thought I had performed an incredible feat when I was bounced up to the 5th standard within 1 year of being in Kalor. This was particularly remarkable because I had previously been attending a kindergarten class in Bombay, and apart from my being able to read, I hadn't learned anything new in the interim period. My sister Dolly, 2 years older than myself, was put into the same class as myself, and the effect of this on her self-esteem was not taken into consideration. Most of the time we seemed to be free to do whatever we pleased, except for a short period in the day when we were in Miss Cooper's class for arithmetic. She was one of the 2 teachers whom my father had helped escape from Burma when the Japanese had begun their advance. She was Anglo-Indian, slender of build, and wore her hair in the style of most modern women of the time, of medium length and permed with a Tony home perming kit. We knew she had had a fresh perm because she would arrive in class with tight curls in her hair, and the strong odor of ammonia lingered in the air around her. It was rumored that Miss Cooper was very strict, and I witnessed this on more than one occasion. When Desmond Saw, the son of a Sawbois and a boarder at Kingswood School, threw a piece of paper out of the window of the second-floor classroom, she had him go downstairs and pick it up. When he got back, she had him remove his leather belt and then strapped him with it. She could occasionally be seen walking in a zigzag fashion down the long outer corridors of the school, which she said was to make the trip longer and that it helped her to get more exercise. For a while, she fried thinly sliced potatoes and sold the crisps to the students during mid-morning break. The lax atmosphere of the school encouraged my cousin Anne and I to play truant, and it didn't appear that anyone at the school noticed our absence, because at the time there was a minimum of supervision and instruction going on in the classes. For instance, we just walked out of school taking a leisurely stroll down the road and made ourselves comfortable on the embankment that overlooked the road which wound its way to the convent. We simply sat there on the grass and sang songs, one of which was, "Ramona, I hear the mission bells above." On another occasion, we decided to visit Dawn Fairbanks, whose mother was a teacher in the school and who lived with her parents across from the school in a house provided by the mission. They had a guitar, and we picked it up and learned to sing to it with songs like "From this valley they say you are going," and "Oh, I wish I had someone to love me." We had no qualms about wandering away from school, and a couple of days later, We decided to go for a long walk around the area, making our way through the jungle, admiring the crocus, which looked more like pink daffodils, and some stunted palms that nestled in the undergrowth. We found and picked a few karunda, which were not very plentiful, and we had wandered a fair distance from school, just off Circular Road, when we heard the sound of a car pull up and stop on the road. Looking through the bushes, I was astonished to see my parents in our jeep. I immediately went over to them and asked them what they were doing there. And they wanted to know what I was doing there and why I was not in school. Obviously, they had been notified that I was missing from school and had come out looking for me. Knowing that I had disappeared from school together with Anne, they had been heading towards Connaught, where she lived, and where they suspected I would be. I was not reprimanded, but I was told to get into the car, and Anne was told to go on home, which was just a few houses away from where we were. Anne, my precocious cousin, who was just a year older than I, already had a boyfriend, Oscar Shirazi. I wrote a love poem on her behalf to him, and she didn't believe I had written it, even though it was rather simple and silly. She suggested I should have a boyfriend too, and coaxed me to send a love letter to Stanley Durham, a boy from the convent whom I had never met or ever seen. My giving in to her suggestion caused all the agonizing teasing I had to endure from Henry David when I was later transferred back to the convent. Anne was on the plump side, big-boned and rather plain-looking, taking after her father, not like her older sister Marina, who was slender and pretty, with green eyes and wavy chestnut hair, and of whom it was said looked like her mother. Anne, spoiled and doted upon by her rich father, was self-assured, and I learned at a young age that it wasn't looks, but confidence that got you what you wanted. Many years later, when she settled in the United States and heard that there was a job opening at a bank, she walked in and became the manager. Maggie, their older stepsister, who after their mother passed away took charge of Marina and Anne, whacked their hands with a hairbrush to punish them for bad behavior, which I found rather strange and cruel, because this was not at all how my eldest sister Raffia interacted with us. Poor Morgan, the older of the second last batch of my big uncle's children, was bundled off to a Catholic boarding school at a young age and never really got to know his own family. I met him once on one of his rare visits to Callao, and I remember him then as soft-spoken, gentle and kind, and I must have been right in my assessment of him, because in recent years, now that I have a little more contact with him, his demeanor hasn't changed. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson were an American missionary couple who lived on a farm in Sher Basti. They had an extensive orchard of orange trees and countless children to tend it, all of whom were either adopted or fostered. We heard that Mr. Anderson was very strict and used his belt to whip them into obedience. Some of the children attended Kingswood School with us, and we often saw them arrive piled into an open trailer hitched onto the back of a jeep. Included in the Anderson clan were 3 children of the Float family. The oldest of the 3 was a girl who was probably about 15 at the time, and she told me that they had lost their father when he died because his stomach had burst. I was shocked and imagined him with a huge distended belly which suddenly exploded. She had 2 younger siblings, one of whom was Robert, a boy about my age who had sad hazel eyes and wrote me a love letter which only served to annoy me. Then there were the children of the missionary Mantons, who were boarders at Kingswood. I can see them now, Caris Manton, with her wavy golden hair, catching the sunlight as she played the piano, and Thomas, her younger brother, about my age, standing there that morning in assembly, looking angelic, with his dark curly hair and blue eyes, looking soulfully skyward while he sang the hymn, God who touches earth with beauty. Patrick and Michael Fay were two brothers who temporarily lived in Callao with their father and attended Kingswood School. I remember them because their father used to drive his truck, shifting into lower gear as he drove his sons to school up Kingswood Hill, and then when coming downhill would turn off the engine and freewheel all the way to save on petrol. The school had planned a concert to celebrate Miss Reed, the principal's birthday, and Dawn Fairbanks danced as a fairy on the stage while we sang, I am the fairy of the well. The concert had opened with all the students singing a special birthday song to Miss Reed. This was a different and longer version which we had been taught by Mr. Silcox, and it was set to a totally different tune. We wish a happy birthday to you, our dear, dear friend. The words and the tune may have been composed by one of the teachers, in particular probably Mr. Silcox, who apart from being our gym teacher was also the one who played the piano during our singing classes. Ironically, in this class, the songs we learned were hymns which we followed along in our hymn books, accompanied by Mr. Silcox on the piano. While later, when we moved to the convent, we learned songs such as All the Nice Girls Love a Sailor and Enjoy Yourself, It's Later Than You Think. Some of the hymns we sang while in Kingswood were Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus, and other hymns such as Life on earth is all a warfare, foes within and foes without. I enjoyed singing these hymns because of the rhythm and the tune and paid no attention to the words, not realizing that the first of these hymns was probably written at the time of the Crusades, when I, as a Muslim, would have been on the opposing side. And the dismal definition of life as warfare in the second hymn had no place in my life, where each day was filled with new and exciting things. So it's not surprising that my favorite hymns, the ones which I understood and paid attention to, were the ones which related directly to my world. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres. And God who touchest earth with beauty, make me lovely too. With thy spirit recreate me, make my heart anew. And then further down in the hymn the words, like the springs and running waters, make me crystal pure. Like the straightness of the pine tree, make me tall and sure. Up on Kingswood Hill lived the Bengali family of Ghosh. They were a large group that included uncles, aunts, and cousins. The children I remember were Patrick, who was about my older brother Arthur's age, Maya, who was a year or two older than I was, and her cousin Arthi, who was probably only a year older than Maya, but seemed to be rather precocious, because she talked about frightening things like bleeding from the place where you pee. I didn't believe her, of course. One day, according to Maya, the older men folk in her family had gone to another town, and when the men hadn't returned by midnight, the women became worried that they might have been waylaid by dacoits. However, they did return safely, but Maya said that the women had not prepared the beds for the men till they actually returned, because if they had, it would have brought about an evil turn of events for the men. The few seconds that it took her to tell me about this has left me in such a strong subconscious superstition that even today I think twice about turning down the sheets for the night for those who have not yet returned home. It is remarkable how the words, thoughts, and actions of those around us over the years of our lives mold the thoughts and actions of the individuals we eventually become. The Convent, Chapter 63. My father's sudden departure from our lives in 1949 resulted in Eunice, my older brother, having to give up his studies at the university in Rangoon. He took up a position with the newspaper and earned 200 chats a month, all of which he sent to my mother to support us. Raffia, who was 19, Arthur 17, and Safia 15, were in Townji with my cousins, Henry and Ivan. My sisters were training to become secretaries, studying shorthand and typewriting with Mr. Johns, a South Indian gentleman who taught stenography, while my brother helped my cousins at their newly constructed flour mill. The dream of my father to give all his children a university education was no longer feasible. It soon became evident that Kingswood School had not regained its pre-war level of education, that the classes had been thrown together haphazardly, and there was inconsistency in the rules and regulations. As a result, my mother thought it advisable to enroll us again in St. Agnes's Convent after my father's death. The convent sat up on a hill and was a series of buildings set at different levels, connected by steps. It was cloistered among the trees and could only be reached on one side by a shortcut, which was the more commonly used route, a rough path cut into the base of the hill where the earth had flattened with regular trampling of feet. Frequent downpours during the rainy season had eroded the soil, exposing the gnarled roots of trees that crisscrossed and forced our feet to tread with agility or stumble. Falling away from this path was a small valley, at the bottom of which small blue primrose-like flowers bloomed on either bank of a gurgling brook. When Tennyson wrote "The Brook," he must have been thinking of this one. On the other side of this path extended another shortcut that went up past the Gurkha Mali's hut, which was surrounded with wild, unkempt jungle, and then rose upward to meet a series of steps that led to the convent. Trudging up the slope and ascending a few steps, one entered a carefully landscaped area that opened onto a small garden fronting Mother Superior's office. Above her office were the living quarters of the nuns, where the mysterious life evolved of those who taught us and others whom we never saw except on Sundays. They appeared in church, their soft female forms encased in habits of heavy white starched cotton and bonnets whose pleated fronts protruded so far forward that their faces were completely hidden in profile. From Mother Superior's office, a series of steps led up to the chapel on the left, a long, low structure with large wooden doors which opened into a small hall which had polished wooden pews on either side and an altar on the end with artillery shell vases filled with flowers. The air in this room felt heavy, as if weighted by many years of the countless lamentations and prayers that had emanated softly from the lips of bowed heads upon which the sunlight fell dimly through stained glass windows. Looking over the entire interior, high above the altar stood the cross, with a sad and cruel reminder of the crime committed on Calvary Hill. In contrast to the pretty dresses we had worn to Kingswood School, the three of us, Dolly, Bilkis, and myself, were rigged out in convent uniforms with white blouses, navy blue ties, navy blue tunics, tied around the waist with a black wool girdle, black shoes, and white socks. My first day of school at the convent was memorable in that I met Gladys and Beryl Shirazi for the first time. The Shirazis were migrants from Iran who, like our family, had seized the opportunity of better prospects and landed in Burma. Their clan comprised a large number of aunts, uncles, and a host of cousins. They owned a large, relatively upscale store on the main street that sold a host of items, including chocolate bars, which most of the townsfolk couldn't afford, so they probably catered to a very limited elite clientele. They were the other family in the town who, besides us, owned a car. Of this large extended family, Gladys and Beryl were the only ones around my age, and they immediately seemed to have an affinity for me. The first day they met me, they each grabbed one of my hands and pulled me in opposite directions, fighting over which one of them was to become my friend. It was rather odd, considering we had all lived in Kalor and within a block or two of each other, and yet had never met before. Not long after I met them, their older cousins, Shireen and Nargis Shirazi, who lived a block away from us, celebrated their wedding, each to a Persian young man. It was a grand affair, and though we didn't attend it ourselves, we observed the celebration and the colorful clothes they wore, which were easily visible from the upstairs windows of our house. All the females in the Shirazi family had their hair regularly permed, and for this auspicious occasion their hair had been especially coiffured and sprinkled with glitter, which in school the next day still sparkled in the tight dark curls of Gladys's newly permed hair. The wedding celebrations continued for several days, but Gladys, Beryl, and Shirley continued to attend school, participating in the festivities when they got home. They seemed to carry the aura of the joyous event with them, even to school, and it seemed to buoy the spirits of all those around them. As part of the festivities, sweetmeats and other delicacies were sent to our home, but we were not allowed to eat the food because we were told that the Shirazis were Shia and that Shias had a custom of spitting on the food before they sent it to Sunnis, who we were designated as, though before this we were unaware of religion being a distinguishing factor in social interactions. In reality, the difference between Sunnis and Shias can be vast or slim depending on the method of practice. Sunnis adhere strictly to the basic rituals and tenets of Islam as they believe the Prophet Muhammad himself did. The Shias believe they are doing the same, except that they give Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, a very high status. They also commemorate the massacre of the Prophet's grandson Hussein and his family during the lunar month known as Muharram by wearing black clothing. During this time, they are known to practice self-flagellation to the extent that the surface of the skin breaks and bleeds. They also walk on live coals and lament loudly while beating their hands on their chests and weeping, especially when the story of the terrible event is dramatically told and retold to large gatherings. This is done by specific individuals who, with the use of emotionally charged tones, touch upon that deep secret sorrow that lies within each of us and create catharsis. Biases based on ignorance and hearsay caused a rift among the adults and initially segregated us. But the innocence of children stood us in good stead, for we created no barriers of race, ethnicity, or religion and became good friends. Gladys and Beryl lived with their younger sister Shirley and baby brother Patrick on the lower slopes of Pagoda Hill, a short distance from their cousins. I went over to their house one day and we played indoors while it rained outside. After the rain shower, we stepped out into the small garden beside their house. A few clouds still lingered in the blue sky, and though the ground looked soggy and the flower petals still hung a little limp, a plum tree glistened with a washed clean wetness, its branches heavily laden with plums in various stages of ripening. We picked a few, and biting into one, I found it sweet and delicious. Looking down, I noticed a fairly long white silk ribbon, slightly splattered with mud, lying on the ground under the tree. I pointed it out to the girls, and they looked at it disinterestedly, so I asked if I could have it. They were a little surprised that I would want it, but were fine with my taking it. I took it home, washed it, ironed it, and used it to tie my hair. Every time I bite into a plum, the flavor and scent of it brings back the memory of that day, that plum, and the ribbon. Almost 2 years had passed since my father died, and my mother was finding it extremely difficult to manage on the funds she had. It was at this point that she had to make a decision that must have been very difficult for her. She decided to sell the house, and it was shortly sold to the civil surgeon who had given our father the injection that seemed to have ended his life. Then my sisters completed their stenographer courses and together with Arthur joined my brother Eunice in Rangoon. Dolly, Bilkis, and myself changed from being day students at the convent to boarders, and Farouk and Salim left with my mother to join the rest of the family in Rangoon. In the convent, we all had chores, simple things like making our own beds, which we had to do to perfection to satisfy Mother Seraphine, stretching the white damask cotton counterpane till it was as taut as the surface of a table. Mother Seraphine was in charge of the boarders in the girls' section and was particular to the extent that she would call us out of class to smooth out the tiniest of wrinkles on the bed. It certainly affected me in a big way, because to this day I cannot stand an unmade or untidily made bed. We also had to dust our own wooden desks in the classroom and the wooden panels of polished teak which lined the corridors adjacent to the classrooms, where large clay pots of lacy maidenhair ferns stood in evenly spaced rows on the floor on either side of the aisle. These long corridors were the ones that Mother Superior slowly walked up, tall and almost masculine, her white habit with the long pleated skirt and her bonnet somehow incongruous on her person. She started at the lowest level of the building, where the kindergarten classes were, and making the sign of the cross, she then recited, "Our Father who art in heaven." All the students stood in 2 rows, one of boys and the other of girls. The boys stood with their backs to the inner walls, and the girls faced them with their backs to the outer parapet. There was a soft hum of voices as the students repeated the prayer along with Mother Superior. I moved my lips quietly, saying, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds. The first surah of the Quran, as taught to me by my father, while William Hussein and Win Pugsley, who were shorter than I was then, stood across from Gladys and myself, invariably giggling and making funny faces at us. As Mother Superior walked past me, I would again notice the large dark brown mole on her chin, which had a lone, wiry, long black hair growing out of it, and I guessed it must be some kind of penance for her, because she never removed it. The wooden panels along the inner wall of the corridor were the ones the boarders were supposed to have dusted, and to make sure we had done a good job, Mother Seraphine would take up the edge of her black apron and run it along the grooves. If any dust showed up on her apron, we had to do the dusting again, till she was completely satisfied. That same apron was used on one occasion for the most sinister deed of squishing within its folds a young bat that had fallen from the rafters of the large recreation hall where Mother Catherine read stories to the boarders after supper. The girls paid avid attention as Mother Catherine read from the thin paperback and tried to identify with the English characters of Mary, Jane, Elizabeth, and others. The original Burmese names of the students themselves had been changed by the nuns to anglicized ones, so that instead of Kinkinji or Mahla Mie, they were now called Victoria, Lily, Cecilia, or Pamela. Because of her admiration for the heroine in one of the schoolgirl series books, one of the boarders named Victoria decided to change her name to Priscilla. Miss Pearl, our class teacher, arranged to support Victoria's change of name by charging us 5 pias every time we referred to Victoria by her previous name instead of Priscilla. I was never comfortable with that, because she didn't look anything like the Priscilla or even a Victoria of those stories, which were of English girls in England, but the name eventually stuck and she became Priscilla Tin. Changing a person's name seems to create only a fleeting change in people, but unless there is a deep and actual change in the basic character of the individual, we are left with a different label, but with the same person. Rarely had toilet paper in the bathrooms and had to use newsprint occasionally, but Victoria, Priscilla, would never use paper with writing on it because she said the name of God might be printed on it. She said that the Ponjis used sticks, split bamboo pieces that resembled tongue depressors, to wipe their bottoms, and I told her that I thought that would be most uncomfortable, and that in any case I didn't believe her. We ourselves found it quite strange to be using paper of any kind, because we were used to the Indian and particularly the Muslim way of using a lota to wash ourselves after using the toilet, and I never felt really clean with this paper wiping procedure, which was all that was available to us while we remained at the convent. I often wonder what became of Millie, the Mali's daughter, who had been the only Gurkha student in the entire school and lived in a small hut with her parents at the bottom of Convent Hill. She was named Millie, not a Gurkha name, but the anglicized name given to her by the nuns. Her father belonged to the group of Nepalese Gurkhas who had come to Burma with the British Army as soldiers in the Gurkha Rifles, and when they were discharged, took up residency in the hill stations of the Shan states of Burma, and many became market gardeners. They quickly acquired expertise in their new careers, and it was considered a great asset to employ one of them as a mali or gardener for one's private garden. On one occasion, I had missed a day of school, and when I returned the next day, Millie said to me, "Do you know what happened yesterday? Miss Pearl dropped her menses. She bumped into the window, and her menses dropped down onto the floor." The window she referred to was the one that opened inwards into the classroom, the same window from which Henry David often peered in on his detours from his class, which was further down the hallway. He would stand at an angle clearly visible to us, but out of the line of vision of Miss Pearl, and make funny faces at us, causing Robert Tranter and myself to have giggling fits. This annoyed Miss Pearl, who turned beet red, not knowing why we were laughing, and probably thought we had a secret joke about her that we shared. Sometimes Robert and I would just look at each other and laugh with no clue as to why we were giggling. Just teenage hormones, I suppose, spurred on by the contagion of each other's laughter and by the fact that we were not supposed to laugh in Miss Pearl's class, particularly because she herself rarely smiled. Everything Miss Pearl taught us was in finite terms. All things that ever needed to be known were already known, and were imparted to us with the understanding that we had to accept and memorize it as the most recent and relevant knowledge attainable. The boundaries and borders of countries were changeless, as were the books, of which there were few. We did not question this comfortable state of affairs, only competing, some of us, to retain the information for the duration of the class year. Undoubtedly, we learned to multiply, subtract, and add, but all of this at a leisurely pace, because there was time enough for us to acquire most of the knowledge available. Miss Pearl taught us English, history, and geography, the last of which meant teaching us about the United States. We had to memorize all the states and draw maps till some of us got quite proficient at it, even though that country was so far removed from us. Some of us, like my sister Dolly, was so disinterested in the boring classes that she gave up trying to master it. Then came the day we had to have a test where we had to draw a map, so my sister Dolly just looked out of the window and drew a copy of a cloud she saw in the sky. I think she got a better mark for that than some of the other students who lacked artistic skills and were not as creative as she was. One day, as part of Miss Pearl's idea to give us a better understanding of what a tropical forest looked like, she suggested that we create some pictures. With great interest and with no explanation that the forest around us was what we were supposed to illustrate, we turned out watercolor, colored pencil, and crayon representations of the Amazon, with anacondas and giant flesh-eating plants. These decked the wall in a straight row along the back of the classroom, directly behind us, and in plain sight of our teacher at all times. We never did study the Amazon, but whenever I read or hear about that rainforest and its significance, those gaudy pictures pop up in my mind. Miss Pearl, who had earlier seemed to appreciate my literary skills, became rather cold toward me, however, after my indiscretion with her geography notes. Previous to this incident, she had even allowed me to skip an outdoor activity on the red earth of the basketball field because I had said that I wanted to stay in and write poetry. She decided to challenge us once to a contest for Mother's Day. We each had to compose a poem, and the best composition was to be chosen by the students in the class as the winner. I wrote what I thought was a beautiful poem, which had flowed into my mind like a gift, in a way poets describe as inspired as opposed to worked at. I had completed a rough draft of the poem, but it had many scribbles due to my attempts at perfecting it. During the lunch break, just before the class started, I sat at my desk and, looking at the rough draft, started writing a fair copy. Miss Pearl was sitting at her desk by this time, and when I finished, I handed her the neatly written poem. She took it, looked at it dubiously, and put it on her desk with some of the other students' poems that had already been handed in. A few minutes later, the rest of the class arrived, and those who had not yet handed in their poems did so, and our afternoon session started. Miss Pearl shuffled her broad base in the chair and crossed her legs, which we could see beneath her desk. There was a slight bulge where her feet met the upper lip of her high-heeled shoes. We sat in the pin-drop silence she demanded, and got, as she began to read aloud each student's poem to the class. She read each poem clearly and distinctly till she came to mine, reading through it glibly and merging the lines in a way that deprived the words of their meaning. Even as a young girl, I was aware that a poem could live or die depending on how it was read, and I became acutely aware of what she was doing. The class voted for the poem that she had brought to life and probably made her own corrections of it in the reading without the students knowing. I think she didn't give me credit for my poem because she thought I had copied it from somewhere else, when in fact I was copying it from my own rough draft. I did not retain a copy of the poem for long and have forgotten most of what I had written, and if I read it today, I would undoubtedly find innumerable flaws in it. But I do remember that I had ended the poem with a famous quote from William Wallace. Quotes, "For the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world." End of quote. I assumed that it was that line that made Miss Pearl sure that I had plagiarized the entire poem, even though I had put in quotation marks to indicate that particular line was a quote. Our history lessons were all based on the small book by Harvey on Burma, which had no relevance to our current lives. And so the only remnants of those classes that remain in my mind are the story of an orator whose wife, Panchakalyani, was banished because she preferred to bathe more often than he did, and the story of her son Chanzita, who became king after Anorata. Then, of course, there was a horrible story of Prince Naradu, son of the great and gentle king Alaunsitu. We never learned about the latter's achievements, about how the falling of rose apples from the tree into the river inspired him to introduce new notes into Burmese music, nor how he standardized weights and measures or his piety. We didn't learn that as he lay ill in his 81st year, he was removed to the Shwegu temple, and that here the peace and tranquility revived him. All we learned was that his son Naratu couldn't wait to become king, so he grabbed the bedclothes and pressed them against his father's face, smothering him to death. Perhaps it is best that we were spared brutal realities of the period, such as the gruesome murder of Naratu himself only 3 years later by the plunging of daggers, each by one of 8 men, and then their killing each other because they had spilled royal blood. We also could have learned that there were poet-philosophers such as Anantaturiya, the chief minister during the reign of Naratenka, the son of Naradu. The king, Naratenka, plotted against his brother Narapatisitu to steal his wife, and in the process lost not only his throne but also his life. Rage, the brother Narapatisitu began the usual general executions that took place after a change of kingship, which included the chief minister Anantaturiya, who was handed over to the executioners. It was at this point that he wrote the oft-quoted verse, "Tudi te yau kaumbo yau mu, tu te yau ma pielingata damatati." And my translation, "For the prosperity and victory of one, it is natural that another should be undone." I still puzzle over that philosophy, which portrays a rather depressing win-lose scenario rather than a win-win possibility. But with the weight of his imminent execution upon him, the philosophical leaning of his mind in the direction it took must have been a source of some comfort. Harvey's original text with a preface and appendix were not available to us. Instead, we were given an abridged and modified version of his original book. The more gory details and sordid infidelities were kept from us, and I think this had more to do with a prevailing global sense of morality at the time that dictated what young children could be allowed to learn about the adult world. A lifetime later, when I came across a copy of the original book, I was sorry that I had not had an opportunity to delve more deeply into the history of my homeland all those years ago. It occurred to me that many of the kings were probably Indian Rajas, Anorata for Anuradha and Chanzita for Chansitara, as was Panchakalyani, Panch Kalyan. We learned nothing about who the people of Burma were, the origins of their script, how a large percentage of them had become literate. We had students of almost every tribe of Burma in our school: Kachin, Karen, Arakanese, Mon, Shan, and others, yet we knew nothing about the different states or the people and the culture of those who lived in our own country. We learned a lot about Catholicism, but learned nothing about animism or Buddhism or the transition from one to the other. This land of countless pagodas, each a holy shrine, also represented the paradoxical nature of humankind. For in the heart of each tiered brick and mortar structure sat the image of the gentle Buddha who preached nonviolence. Often guarding it was the spirit of a human child or adult who had been sacrificed either by being buried alive or by being brutally murdered. The pagodas rose to a spire, encircled at the apex by small bells, which, when teased by the breeze, rendered silvery music, giving voice to the spirits of the guardians. The innocence and simplicity with which Buddhism was adopted and manifested created an interesting tapestry of animism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. We had no clue about the rich and diverse culture and traditions of our land, the geomorphology or the geology, the amazing range of botanical life or the ornithology. Maybe to know the foreign language, Latin title of the flora and fauna we observed would have depleted their essence, their aura, and made them somehow finite. Having failed to study them academically, they simply grew in our hearts and minds and blended into the infinite eternity that lingers on even after our last breath dissipates. Our curiosity did not extend to picking the petals till we had a broken flower, but we breathed in its perfume and gave it the highest rank by wearing it in our hair. There were tiny pink cockspur flower heads, which we placed in our cupped hands and blew on, so that they whirled around like roosters in a cockfight. And then there were the pliant, bright, deep orange petals of poppies, which we quickly gathered together at their tips, trapping unsuspecting bees who were deeply absorbed in seeking honey, and then allowed them to buzz off confusedly. We released them. We mimicked the call of different birds to trick them into responding, and when we wished, we played with the smooth, silky texture of the red, yellow, and white clay, mixing it with water and molding it into bowls, cups and saucers, pots, and even tea kettles. Our world was filled with all the materials our imagination and our nimble fingers could will to create, whether simple or elaborate. We discovered and marveled at bamboo and the myriad uses it had been set to. We saw it in the framework of houses, in mats, walls, and floors, and we saw it used as the side rails and rungs of ladders. We ourselves used it to make knitting needles and benefited from its flexibility when we used thin strip of it in the kites we made. We also ate delicious, sweet, sticky rice that had been stuffed into tubes of bamboo and steamed, and we also knew, though we had not yet sampled it, that tender bamboo shoots were eaten as a delicacy. The ease with which we were able to imagine, create, and interact with our environment was magical, so that we were in a state of constant wonder and delight. We breathed in the air of its botanical wonders, felt the endless variety of the texture of leaves and flowers, marveled at the colors, shapes, and scents, looked up at the trees that grew majestically towering high above us, and crept under the branches of those bending low with the weight of their fruit. We heard and saw the variety of wildlife, not in picture books or on screens, but all around us. We touched and played with the geological sand, clay, and earth, climbed the hills and rolled down the valleys, and made and became a vital living part of the history of the land. We were at symbiosis with heaven and earth. As I mentioned before, Mother Catherine read stories to the boarders every night after supper, if they were good, which meant every night, because they were always good, but I didn't sit in and listen because I would have already read the book. I had been the one who had introduced Mother Catherine to the series of books after I had received my first copy of Schoolgirl's Own Library from my brother Arthur. I didn't have the pleasure of opening the package myself when it arrived at the convent. I was just given the book by Mother Superior, who had told me that it had been sent to me by my brother. The package addressed to me from my 17-year-old brother would have meant that, of course, Mother Superior would have opened it herself, as she read everything we received, and also that which we sent out by mail. I once wrote a letter to my brother Eunice that she read immediately and then reprimanded me severely for the tone of rudeness she said she had noted. She said that even though my intentions may have been good, a letter was not the same as talking to someone face to face. She warned against hurting someone's feelings by saying things in a letter without intending to, and made me rewrite the letter and made sure she approved of it before it was mailed. I have no recollection of the content of that letter today, but ever since I have been extremely cautious about the words I choose in communicating by mail. While the rest of the boarders listened intently to the stories read to them by Mother Catherine, I played with the 3 porcelain dolls which sat on the table against the wall, or read some of the stories in the huge tomes of collected Catholic digests. The short stories in these digests were strange and very different from those in the schoolgirl library books, as they were intended more for adults, sort of Catholic stories with a moral. I was not too interested in them, but I had already read all the books in Mother Superior's small library, and there was nothing else to read. The stories in the schoolgirl's own library I could identify with, and my wild imagination allowed me to live the excitement, mystery, and adventure with the protagonists. I had also developed some poetic skills, or so I thought, which for me at that time was to write in rhyme. Living in the convent and being steeped in an atmosphere of Catholicism, the idea of heaven and hell, purgatory and sin must have entered my mind by osmosis, because though I don't remember what dark stories I heard about the wages of sin, they must have been what inspired me to write a poem, the first verse of which I recollect was, "Into the depths of hell I plunged, my soul all soaked in sin, and there I met a fiery hound who took me right within." And the poem went on to say that I rode on this hound right through hell and finally came out on the other side, all pure and clean, and in quotations, under God's heavenly light. A few of us boarders were invited one day to a party at Henry David's house. This was to include Kathleen Prestano, my sister Dolly, and myself. Kathleen, a Catholic, had been practically adopted by the nuns, and she never seemed to go home, even during the holidays. On rare occasions, we would see her mother, who visited her occasionally, and there was a stark difference between the two of them. Her mother had a mixture of Indian and European features, was slender and of medium height, while Kathleen was plump and short and had Mongolian features closely resembling the Japanese. We were quite excited to be attending this party, particularly because we had never been to one, and were also delighted to know that there was going to be a dance. However, we were not the only ones to find out about the planned dance at Henry's. Mother Superior called us into her office and told us that we were wicked girls to have planned to go to the party knowing that there was to be a dance. She said that it was out of the question that we would have her permission to attend, and that we should never take part in things like that. We stood before her, tongue-tied and disappointed. I once told Mother Seraphine that I wanted to become a Catholic, and she said that I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't know if she meant that I was better off being Muslim or that I didn't have enough knowledge about Catholicism. She used to have some heated arguments with Father Baldrini and also with Mother Superior, and though I never understood a word of the Italian they were speaking, it appeared to me that she always had the upper hand. I wanted to be Catholic because the Catholic students had all these interesting extra rituals that seemed like privileges, and also because Gabriel, frail-looking little Chinese boy, won a doll after he converted to Catholicism. This was the very doll that I had played with after supper while all the other boarders sat and listened to Mother Catherine tell them stories. Gabrielle won that doll when a raffle was held for my favorite doll, and I had bought a ticket, sure that I would win it because I was the only one who had any interest in the doll. I cried broken-heartedly when I learned that it wasn't even a girl but a boy who had won what I considered was my doll. The small group of Catholic students' sessions where they were taught catechism and special topics were discussed. One such session occurred when the Korean War in 1950 had just begun, and though the war was fought entirely on the Korean peninsula, the recent events of World War II and the sudden occupation of Burma by the Japanese was not far from the minds of the nuns in the convent. The little girls in the group of Catholic children were told that if the Korean soldiers descended on the convent, the older girls and the nuns would have to go into hiding because the soldiers would have wicked intentions about them. It would therefore be the duty of the little girls, whom the soldiers would have no interest in, to run over to the church, grab the jar with all the hosts in it, and protect and hide it, because it contained the flesh and blood of Christ. They would have to swallow all the hosts, being careful not to chew or bite on them, because doing so would cause the hosts to bleed. There was a story floating around to enforce the literal interpretation of the hosts, which said that a thief had entered the church one day and stolen the hosts. He had wrapped them up in his handkerchief and run away with it. He was soon caught, however, by the trail of blood droplets lying on the ground along the route of his escape. He was found still holding the blood-soaked handkerchief with the squished hosts inside. That was sufficient material to embellish the nightmares of young minds for several nights. The Catholic children attended special services at the chapel where non-Catholics were not expected, though occasionally we would help Mother Seraphine arrange the flowers. All the vases in the chapel were made from sawn-off arterial shells, and each day Mother Seraphine would make sure they were filled with flowers, dahlias, gladioli, chrysanthemums, and cosmos. She would carefully weed out the dying flowers and replace them with fresh ones. The scent of these flowers still lingers, as does the incense that Father Baldrini distributed through the front pews of the church that we had to attend on Sunday mornings. We would watch him as he solemnly swung the incense container like a pendulum and chanted, Miserere Medius, secundum magnum misericordiam tuam. Have mercy on me, God, according to your great kindness. Et secundum multitudinem miserationem tuarum, dele iniquitatem meam, and according to the multitude of your mercies, erase my iniquities. He continued to recite in Latin, which none of us understood till later, when I became curious and found out the meaning of the entire prayer. There were 2 lines in particular that worried me and left me wondering about the sanctity of my mother and the purity of myself. Et in peccatis concepit me mater mea, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Until that moment, mine had been the Muslim belief that marriage was a sanctified relationship between a man and a woman, and that all children were born completely free of sin. I had already struggled for a while with the concept of original sin, which in Catholicism we were all supposed to be born with, and now this was compounded with the added sin of my mother. At that moment I felt glad I was a Muslim, and from then on had this perception of Catholics as having a faintly distinguishable sinful aura which aroused in me a genuine sympathy for them. How easily we consonance ourselves by creating differences between us and them. The incense in the church used to make me lightheaded, and the hard wooden pews we had to kneel at hurt my knees. As boarders, we had our place in the front pews of the church with the few Europeans and Anglo-Indians, while at the rear of the church, sitting on mats on the floor, were native and other, mainly South Indian converts, a not so very subtle segregation. I fainted once, to the consternation of the nuns, then decided to move me and my sisters to another location. The new spot they chose for us was on the balcony that hung high over the pews at the back end of the church, where we were made to join the choir. This we enjoyed tremendously because we loved to sing. We sang Ave Maria and a host of Latin hymns that we didn't understand, the words of which were probably blasphemous for us Muslims to be singing. I remember one of the nuns in that choir having a really powerful voice, and I almost think that she may have been an opera singer before she joined the nunnery. I wondered what her life in Italy must have been before she cloistered herself in a convent, and who had that young nun been whose body we had been allowed to view as she lay serene in white, hands clasped in prayer pose. What took her life? But we didn't have questions then about those who died. They were dead, and the word dead didn't really mean anything. It was just a word. It didn't arouse any emotion in me, just the way pouring kerosene on the brightly colored hairy caterpillars and setting them alight with a match left me psychopathically immune. Was this a phase in growth where a certain area of my brain had not developed? Why did I not feel connected to the caterpillars then, in the way that today I sense a deep connection to every living thing, as I also do to rocks and earth and sky? In the midst of all this Catholicism, we discovered that it was the month of Ramadan, and my sisters and I decided to fast. The nuns permitted us to do this for the few days we attempted to do so, but were unable to provide us with the atmosphere, the food, or the morning sehri, which was before dawn, so we just fasted straight through without food or water for 24 hours. It was on one of those days that Ralph Trotwin, a friend of my brother Eunice, came to visit us, carrying a basket of beautiful, delicious-looking strawberries. He was shocked and disappointed when we told him that we couldn't eat them until sunset because we were fasting. If it wasn't raining, we went for long walks with Mother Catherine once a week on Sunday afternoons. Before we set out, we had to brush and polish our black leather shoes till they mirrored our faces, and our dark blue berets had to sit just right on our heads. We would also have darned any of our white cotton socks if they had any holes in them, by placing a wooden ball in the toe of the sock and carefully weaving the needle in and out as we were taught by Mother Seraphine. Of course, we would have had our military-style baths on the Saturday before, with the hot water that the Mali would have carried up several levels and many flights of steps. The bamboo pole across his shoulders arched with the weight of the 2 large kerosene tin cans of hot water for each of our baths, 1 trip per boarder, and he must have had to do this in rapid succession because we all had our baths around the same time on Wednesday and Saturday afternoons, the day before the Thursday and Sunday holidays. Dressed in our Sunday best, we trooped along in twos led by Mother Catherine. Going for those walks with her was a great adventure for us because she didn't restrict us from making detours or from stepping off the roadway to pick any interesting plants or berries we saw, and there were many. We picked heady-scented silver lilies that snuggled in the bottom of gullies with their clustered heads balanced at the top of long stems rising from swirls of dark green foliage. We also filled our little baskets along the way with yellow raspberries, which grew in profusion, hanging in bunches on thorny bushes toward the beginning of the rainy season. The little boys trooped behind us, including the 6-year-old boy who wept miserably when he was left at the convent by his parents, his large brown eyes wet with tears that streaked down over his rosy, chubby cheeks. He was one of the little boys under the age of 8 who were allowed admission to the convent as boarders. Older boys were allowed to attend as day students right up to matriculation after the war as a special concession, since the boys' Catholic school had closed at the beginning of the war and never reopened. The little boys were chaperoned by Sister Philomena, another South Indian convert to Christianity like Mother Catherine. She was not only in charge of the boys, but also in charge of our clothing and linen, which she stacked neatly in cupboards that lined one wall at the end of the dormitory. She would scold us for being untidy and say, "Don't be so careless," and we would giggle at her pronunciation. We ourselves had picked up an expression which must have originated somewhere in the army, because I can find no other reason why we girls and boys would end our sentences with men. For instance, we would say, "Come on, men. Let's go, men. You know, men." Once a week, the Dobie would arrive carrying a large bundle of washed and neatly ironed clothes, and Mother Seraphine would supervise the counting of the various items. Among them was a cloth bag with some small items that was neatly tied and not checked. When I asked what was in it, I was told they were things used by the big girls. The big girls were the boarders we younger ones aspired to be, because they seemed to be superior to us in some way. Sister Philomena showed them a lot more respect, and they walked around with an air of quiet confidence and in a way that implied that they held a certain secret. It was a long time before I discovered that the big girls were those who had reached puberty, and the Dobie's little bag held the cotton sanitary napkins that had been washed and were being returned to be reused. The Dobie undertook this because he had been born into a particular Hindu low caste. He and those in his group were trapped in a hereditary cycle of washermen and washerwomen, who it was believed absorbed the filth and sin of what they washed. So they took in the dirty clothes of people and were looked down upon as unclean, especially by the Brahmins, who refused to let them enter their homes and who re-washed their clothes by sprinkling them with water from the Ganges if a Dobie happened to have laundered them. The very topic of menstruation is taboo in many cultures, with menstruating women being classified as impure. They are excluded from many tasks and religious rituals and are even denied the hygiene of bathing during this period. The Hindu relegation of an inferior role to women, especially during the menstrual cycle, was carried over into Buddhism, so that by association it was believed that a woman's longi hanging on a clothesline would cause a man to lose his pom or power if he walked under it. There is also a specific area in the Shwedagon Pagoda where women are not allowed to enter. Mother Superior's feast day celebrations meant several days of rigorous practice and rehearsals of singing, dancing, and the enactment of plays. Some of the plays were ambitious undertakings, such as the Pied Piper of Hamelin, where the whole class was involved, and to Miss Pearl's credit, she gave the lead role of the Pied Piper to Richard Day, a very quiet boy who was introverted and lacked confidence. After his role in the play, in which he performed remarkably well, his whole manner and disposition changed, and we were all amazed at the transformation. Mother Seraphine got us to enact the poem of the spider and the fly by wearing grotesque costumes to represent the creatures, with me being the spider and Shirley Shirazi the fly. She also had me take part in a play about a mother and her son, which was probably taken out of the Catholic Reader's Digest. I was the mother, and Winston, a little boy with sad, soft brown eyes, who was a boarder at the convent, was supposed to be my son. Winston somehow had an affinity for me and followed me around, probably because he was homesick and I reminded him of his mother or older sister. I had to hug him at the end because from being a naughty boy he had amended his ways, and I remember Mother Seraphina's annoyance at my being very uncomfortable with having to do this. The part of the concert that I enjoyed most was where the girls, dressed in their own national Burmese dress, placed flowers in their hair and danced to songs that the Burmese teacher had composed with Burmese words set to English tunes, such as Red Sails in the Sunset. We practiced singing in the new annex that had been constructed beside the kindergarten. This was Mother Catherine's domain. It was a small room with a piano at one end, upon which Mother Catherine thumped away while we crowded in around her and sang, as she instructed, songs such as Betty Boop's "All the nice girls love a sailor," but at the end of the verse, instead of ship ahoy, we were taught ship ahoy, you naughty boy. The roof of the little building was made of corrugated iron sheets that heated rapidly on sunny days, and the temperature in the room soon reached baking levels, causing me to faint more than once. Autograph books were quite a craze for a time, with each of us wandering around with a small book with unruled cream-colored pages ready for writing upon. This we circulated among all our friends and even those whom we didn't know too well. The girls or boys we chose to hand our autograph books to would draw or paint a picture, write a few words, and then sign their names at the bottom of the page. The writing in my autograph book was similar to that of every other student because they were the same standard couplets that we copied into each other's autograph books. The most common of these, for instance, was "Roses are red, violets are blue, honey is sweet, and so are you," and sometimes rather odd expressions such as "A slip of the tongue is no fault of the mind, and such a remark is very unkind." And we also had, "Never marry an old man, I'll tell you the reason why. His nose is always running, and his mouth is never dry." About this time, there seemed to be a slew of incidents involving dacoits around the town of Kalor, particularly along the narrow highway that ran through Kalor to Angban and from there on to Taunji. These dacoits were probably insurgents, one of the various tribal groups in the mountains who sought autonomy from the Burmese government. They were Karen, Mon, Kachin, and Shan, but the majority in our area were probably Shan or remnants of the communist groups that had yet to be disbanded. Many of them had not yet become involved in the profitable opium trade, which incidentally originated in the import of opium into Burma by the British in 1852, so they waylaid passengers who traveled on the trucks, traversing the winding route between Kalor and Taunji. Nervous drivers found huge logs flung across the road, forcing them to halt the vehicle, whereupon fierce, barbaric men, resembling the invaded Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan, jumped onto the bus, brandishing dars or guns, and every single item of any value was violently seized. Most of the trembling passengers quickly parted with their possessions, just feeling fortunate if their lives were spared. The government responded with brutal action when it could, but its reach did not extend beyond lowland Burma, and its hands were already full with trying to deal with the Karen insurgency, which was making considerable inroads into government territory, once advancing almost as far as Rangoon. On one occasion, The local police or army contingent performed some rather gruesome acts as a deterrent, which we witnessed in the photograph that was circulated among us boarders. The decapitated head of the dacoit leader, stuck on a bamboo pole, with his glazed eyes and Beetlejuice-stained teeth, was set up in the marketplace and haunted us for days on end. How much of this type of punishment dissuaded the dacoits is debatable, because we heard of the horrific details of what happened in another Shan town called Kotkai. It was in the home of the Vazes, where the entire family was attacked by a band of bandits wielding dars. They chopped and hacked at the family, leaving them with injuries so severe that they remained in hospital, recovering from the attack for almost a year. Patrick Vaz, who had been a boarder in the convent previously, received a large gash in his skull and wandered out of the house in a daze. He was rescued by a couple in the servants' quarters, who hid him in their room. The family was discovered the next morning, and initially there was panic because Patrick appeared to have disappeared. Upon searching the area, he was found where he had been hidden, with his head wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His wound was so serious that it was predicted he would suffer from brain damage and be unlikely to live a normal life. In fact, he became a doctor, married a Shan nurse, and raised a number of beautiful children. Strange things seemed to be happening in Kalor after we became boarders, and we would hear about them from Millie, the Mali's daughter. She brought us a photograph one day of a man who, from the light coloring of his skin, appeared to be of North Indian descent. His features were aligned symmetrically in a way that conditioned those who saw him to subconsciously expect a beneficial exchange of some kind. His mustache and sideburns merged with his long white beard, forming a partial fluffy mask on his face. His eyes had that acquired look of piety and seemed to look deep into your soul, comfortingly rather than invasively. His long, loose clothing and the turban about his head were of pristine white, and floating all around him in the picture, we saw several smaller images of him. We were awed when Millie told us that that was because he had special powers which enabled him to multiply himself. It was a long time later that we finally understood that the images were superimpositions. The man, we found out, was supposed to be a holy man, a guru, who had relinquished all worldly pleasures and devoted his life to attaining enlightenment through meditation. He had arrived in Kalor from Rangoon and soon mesmerized the simple folk as he sat near the marketplace, with his eyes closed, uttering strings of unintelligible mantras in sing-song tones with his deep baritone voice. There were no wanted posters, like in the Wild West, to warn the people, and news of his previous escapades did not surface till that eventful day when he sat on a raised platform under the banyan tree, looking down on his audience of devotees. Just before sunset, as the sky turned a pastel pink and the shadows grew faint and long, a gentle quiet fell as they sat on the floor before him. The warmth of the day had blended into a pleasant coolness, and the people who waited for him to begin the session were in that state of relaxation and expectancy that is present in crowds who adulate and elevate another human to near divinity. The holy man that day was very pleased with the turnout. Word had obviously got around, and he could see that an assortment of coins and paper money had already started collecting on the blanket which had been placed before him. At that moment, certain chemicals in his brain triggered a domino reaction, which tipped the delicate balance from charlatan to megalomaniac, so that he came to the conclusion that he was indeed imbued with special powers. Does the strength of our convictions about ourselves come solely from our own thoughts, or is it an identity created and imposed upon us by others to satisfy their own inner need? The holy man felt himself rising to a level of spirituality where he determined that his previous indiscretions with the females among his devotees would end. As his eyes roved over the group, he saw the middle-aged Gurkha woman who had been sitting quietly a few feet away from him. He noticed her sun-bronzed skin and the rosiness of her cheeks, against the sides of which dangled her large red and blue beaded earrings. He looked away and over the crowd, but was drawn back to her face. He saw the light of the setting sun glinting off the silver beads of the large nose ring which brushed against her lips, and he felt the urge of his previous indiscretions assert itself, in the manner that one is drawn toward the very thing one is striving to steer away from. The evil in him he projected onto her, and pointing a finger in her direction, he yelled out, "She has a demon in her!" Picking up a big stick, he leapt towards her and began to strike her with it, and then, grabbing her by the hair, swung her around while the terrified woman screamed helplessly. A few people who knew the woman leapt up from the floor and attempted to stop him. Soon the entire crowd was mobilized, and he was held down while the woman was rushed to the hospital. Her sons were notified about what had occurred, and it turned out that she was the mother of 2 soldiers in the battalion that had recently been posted to Kalor. All the holy man's magical powers couldn't stop him from being arrested, and it was discovered that he was a sham and had committed innumerable disreputable acts in other towns in the past. He was banished from Kalor forever, and we never heard of him again.